Okay, so today I have a lot of stuff to share, but the basic trajectory is I'm going to start by talking about the big picture, so climate change stuff, um, which I hope isn't too much review. Um, and then what are sustainable food systems? What would make really the national and in some respects international food system sustainable, as best as I can detail that in the limited time. And then strategies for reducing climate impacts of food, a little bit of weighing those strategies, and how to assess those, and how to move forward from there. Okay, so we're facing a really, really big challenge right now. I'm sure you are aware in some respects, but we are most likely going to have to feed somewhere between 9 to 10 billion people, and that's going to require more food. And yet we are facing climate change, so we cannot simply grow more food, and we're also starting to run out of land. So we have to take all this into account and actually lower emissions while feeding more people. And we'll get into some of the solutions in this presentation. So the big question, can sustainable food systems save the climate? And before I get to the details, I'm going to give you the very, very short answer, which is yes, but not alone. So they're part of the solution, but they cannot be the only solution. And they must be designed very, very carefully. Just to give you an idea, the top 5 ways to cool the planet and put this in context are, if we are looking at particular things and not just agriculture versus energy, the 2 top steps to take are actually reducing food waste and shifting to a more plant-rich diet. And then after that would be family planning and education, refrigerant management, and so that's like CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons and hydrofluorocarbons. And then everybody wants to save the rainforest, and it is very, very important, but it is number 5 on the list by Project Drawdown. I highly recommend this website, www.drawdown.org. As it stands if we look at all the food, agriculture, and land use impacts, that represents about 24% of greenhouse gas emissions. So currently, 24% of anthropogenic human-caused greenhouse gas emissions are coming from agriculture and land use. And then that's about even Steven with energy, and industry is a little bit lower, transportation a little bit lower than that. Buildings are important, but still lower, and then other would be 10%. Please let me know if at any point you cannot see my mouse. I don't know why, but it likes to disappear. And we could try this guy as well. There we go. All right. So then if we measure impacts of food another way, if we include post-retail impacts, so what happens to the food after you throw it away, basically, then that actually food impacts account for 1/3 of emissions, about 34%. And that includes land use and agricultural production itself. So land use change going from forest to agriculture, for example. And then agricultural production itself would be emissions from the soil, from animals, from manure, etc. So now the sources of the emissions are only half the picture. Those emissions all have to go someplace. And so they go into the atmosphere, and then they can be absorbed. Some of them are absorbed, about 41% are absorbed, 24% are absorbed by the land, and 17% by coastal and ocean sinks. And that 17% absorbed by coastal and ocean sinks, that is mostly a bad thing because that contributes to ocean acidification. So when it comes to sustainable food systems, we really need to maximize these land sinks while minimizing the emissions that are coming from food systems. So where exactly is all of this carbon that we're talking about right now? So this is telling us where it's moving, right? But where is it right now is a different question. So most of the carbon on Earth is actually in rocks. And then the second largest, what we call pool, is the oceans, then soil, then air, and then plants. And then in terms of where we can actually put more, well, it would be wonderful if we could put more carbon into rocks, but this is very, very energetically expensive. If you've heard of carbon capture and storage before, that's usually referring to trying to inject carbon dioxide into the ground, storing it in underwater water bodies, or just compressing it as a gas. And as you might imagine, like a bottle opening suddenly, that could all just come back right out if it's not sealed up properly. So this is very tricky. And turning it back into a rock is even more energetically expensive. Then like I said, we don't want to store more carbon in the oceans, except for maybe algae. That's a different story. But we can't do it directly. We can't put the CO2 in there without causing ocean acidification. And so that leaves us with soil, air, and plants. Obviously, there's too much in the air, so air is a no-go. Then we're left with soil and plants. And this is where sustainable agriculture is designed to put carbon, either storing that carbon in the soil or the plants. And long term, the plants are a large part of the plants, unless we're talking about trees. Trees are awesome, but a large portion of the plant material used in agriculture gets harvested. And so we're actually, when people say that a farm is sucking up carbon, they're really talking about the soil most of the time. And the soil is doing it through the plants. So the plants take up the carbon from the atmosphere, and then that is stored in the soil. And how much exactly do we need to remove? Well, basically, we need to get down to 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to keep warming below the safe limit of 2 degrees Celsius. And more recently, 1.5 degrees Celsius has actually been highlighted as a better target. So the first thing we need to do is stop burning coal, and then improve land usage, then cut all fossil fuels. And land usage is a pretty big chunk after coal. So how exactly do we do that? What does a sustainable food system look like? Well, let's first define sustainability. My favorite definition is from a book, Sustainability by Design. I can provide citations later. And that is the possibility that life will flourish upon the earth forever. And that sounds like a big promise, but the idea is we want to keep Earth functioning and healthy, and all of the biological systems within it functioning and healthy as long as possible. So practices that enhance that possibility, that increase that possibility, the likelihood of that happening are more sustainable. Then resilience is an important part of sustainability. It is the ability of a system to absorb disturbance while retaining its structure and function. So we need food systems that won't collapse due to stress and other things. Okay, so how do we do those things? So there's an incredibly long list if we go into details, but broadly speaking, we need to minimize food waste, shift to healthier, lower footprint diets. I know that is a big ask, Then avoid bioenergy crops. So if you're trying to make biofuels using the part of the plant that you would normally eat, that means that the biofuels are competing with food for land, and that causes a big problem because a lot of the ecological footprint of agriculture has to do with land. Then, of course, we want to increase the efficiency, how much we can produce with less land and less water, less fertilizer. And that goes in hand with improving soil and water management. So that includes things like storing carbon in the soil as well, and using less land in general and choosing what land to use wisely. So no cutting down tropical rainforests, but also no draining of peatlands, for example. And then, of course, it's not all about the mechanics. We need to support the people who are behind these food systems. So we need to provide support for families, help economics work out, and also don't forget the people who made the first agricultural systems, native peoples. So we need to incorporate both native knowledge and also, whenever possible, allow native peoples to steward their land. And I wish I had more information on that one today, but it's just not going to fit. Okay, I know this is a lot to look at, but one thing to note is that while agriculture is a source of emissions currently, which is what this little blue bar chunk of the bar means, not blue, green, chunk of the bar means right here, land use and land use change and forestry. That green bar is currently positive, and then down here, if we are to reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions, the land needs to be absorbing, so the soil and plants both need to be net carbon negative. So plants need to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then that needs to be stored in the soil. Okay, so once again, how do we ensure sustainability of these food systems? We talked about these top two strategies up here, reducing food waste and plant rich diets. And these can actually store together hundreds of gigatons of carbon dioxide, well, reduce hundreds of gigatons of carbon dioxide. And also there's some other solutions down here, protecting peatlands instead of draining them. Currently, so peatlands and wetlands are places where plants absorb a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then they sink down and are covered in water. They become submerged and they store a lot of carbon there. And unfortunately, these are often drained for agriculture or for just building infrastructure in general, or they can even be harvested, and that peat can be sold as peat moss to put in your plant, your potting materials. And the potting material is used in greenhouses and such for growing crops. So protecting wetlands such as peatlands goes hand in hand with sustainable agriculture. Don't panic though about your potting mix. You can buy what's called cocoa peat instead, made from coconuts. So we said reducing food waste is number one. Where is all that coming from? So food is wasted at different stages. In the field, some food is subject to disease or wilting as it grows, and that can be considered wasted. And then after the food is harvested, if it's not high enough quality, it gets frequently discarded and will then, then rot and cause more emissions. And then during processing, there's of course emissions from burning of fossil fuels for energy to help process the food, and then distribution, of course, transportation using fossil fuels, and then consumption that includes cooking, and also when food is allowed to go bad in the home before it can be eaten. And then this happens at different to different degrees in different countries, just FYI. In North America, a lot of food waste occurs at the consumption stage, for example. So in your own home, it pays to be mindful of what exactly is in the fridge and when it's going to go bad to reduce that food waste. Oh, I see there's some comments coming in. I will need to save most of those for the end, just FYI, but thank you for all of the questions. A lot of people might not, I debated a long time ago, whether to get local or organic, or local or sustainably raised in some other manner. And it turns out that what you eat actually does matter more than where it comes from. So it's more important in most cases to get organic or sustainably raised. And that is because on-farm emissions greenhouse gas emissions account for 39% of emissions, whereas land use change accounts for 32%. And so that sums up to over 70%, whereas transportation only accounts for 4.8% of emissions. Now, the exception would be stuff that's flown around because it's very perishable, so it has to get where it's going very fast. So that would be things like asparagus, or foods that have to be eaten super, super fresh, like green beans, berries, herbs, occasionally grapes. Seafood that hasn't been frozen is sometimes flown in as well. And unfortunately, there isn't a labeling system in place for you to find out right now what is being flown in. But a lot of foods, especially fresh produce, does frequently state the at least the country of origin, if not the state of origin. So you can kind of gauge how far it had to come and put that together with the type of food, and you can hazard a guess as to whether it might have been flown in. Oh, and then, yeah, so I hope that answers part of one of the questions. And speaking of the food mattering more, it matters a lot more when we start talking about different categories of food. So you might have heard that beef has much higher emissions than other food, and that when we start comparing it to non-meat foods, so not even chicken, we're talking about plant-based foods. When we compare beef to plant-based foods, we're talking about over 10 times more emissions per 1,000 kilocalories. So just based on, it'll be the same per calorie comparison. So per calorie, beef has more than 10 times more causes more than 10 times more emissions than other foods, plant-based foods. And then you might not have, oftentimes it's overlooked that cheese actually causes greater than or similar to emissions compared with poultry. So cheese and chicken are almost even Steven with each other, and in many cases, cheese will have higher emissions associated with it. And that's even greater, unfortunately, for aged cheese. I love aged cheese too, but mozzarella is much better, for example, because there's there's less time for microbes to start eating. Well, cheese is made by allowing microbes to partly eat the milk, okay? And so if they're eating the milk, they're producing a bunch of CO2 and sometimes methane as well. And the longer you give them to eat your milk, the more emissions they're going to create. And then this just reorganizes that according to the amount of protein you gain. And even though a lot of people complain that you might not be able to get enough protein from other sources, that is absolutely not true. You can get enough protein from plant-based sources and from dairy products. And when you compare on a protein basis instead of a calorie basis, beef still has much, much higher emissions compared to plant-based foods. And cheese, unfortunately, still has higher emissions than chicken. Okay, and then not all of these foods in any given category are created equal. So these wide bands of color are indicating that there is a wide range of possible emissions for each type of food. And so, for example, most of the beef emissions are higher than most of the pork, chicken, and egg emissions. But if you were to compare chicken that was raised in a very unsustainable manner with beef that was raised sustainably, and also the cows were also being raised for milk as well, then the footprint is much lower per overall calorie between the beef and the milk produced by those cows. So very unsustainably raised chicken could have higher emissions than very sustainably raised beef. But when we start comparing beef to plant-based foods, we can see that there's still no contest. And this is just zooming in there a little bit more closely in case you couldn't see the previous slide. So there is some fine print here as to why these differences occur. So, what I mentioned about the dairy sector overlapping with the beef sector is what that's saying. And then the chicken can be produced in different ways. And then, of course, some chickens are also raised for eggs. And then among fish, farmed fish sometimes can be raised unsustainably. So if you allow their excrement and their extra food to accumulate at the bottom of the tank, that can produce even more methane than cows. Just zooming in on the other stuff. So the other big question, do you have to give up your meat? Well, short answer is no. Just eating less is enough. And to get into why that is, basically, if you only go, for example, 2/3 vegan, that would lower your footprint by about 50%. And that's on average based on for all countries. And then if we look over here at the United States, here's a vegan diet down here. Here's 2/3 vegan. Okay, not doing quite as well as globally. But look at this, no red meat. Doing that cuts the same amount of emissions approximately compared with going 2/3 vegan. And then just eating low on the food chain. So avoiding eating animals that eat other animals, for example. would have similar emissions to going vegan. So that would cut emissions by 70 to 75%. So so cutting red meat is really important, but you don't have to reduce it all. And this is, these are just some prescribed diets. You can do what suits you. So you can cut, if you're not that into dairy, and you're not that into red meat, you can cut both of those and eat a good amount of poultry and still do quite well. So another question that you might be thinking about is, do we have enough space to grow all this stuff? Because if we have to grow more plants to feed more people, won't that take up more space? Well, the answer is actually no, because we can actually fit all this, no problem, because right now we're actually using up a lot of land to feed the animals. We're growing crops to feed animals. So we are growing over the amount of food we're feeding to animals is over half of what we're feeding to humans. And then the animals, grazing animals, so cows and lamb, use up a lot of pasture space. And that vastly outweighs the amount of cropland currently in use. So if we just cut out the beef and lamb, we can save a lot of space. And then if we remove dairy as well, we don't have to worry about the pasture anymore. And now we're down to about 1 billion hectares, and reducing animal-based foods further, like no red meat, no dairy, no poultry, all makes a really tiny difference on top of that. So, so really, we just need to reduce, once again, the beef and lamb. Oh, and before we get into cows, if you're wondering about lamb and why that's a problem, it's very different from cows. So lamb is an issue because the urine from lambs actually causes an enormous amount of what's called nitrous oxide emissions. Nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And when that urine gets onto the soil, it causes those emissions to increase dramatically. So now you might be wondering, I still want some more beef. What about that grass-fed beef? Well, it's complicated, actually. First off, let's clarify the difference between regular meat and grass-fed beef. So conventional cattle do eat grass still for about 2/3 of their lives on average. And then they're called what quote unquote grain finished, which means they're fed a blend of what's available locally, including high calorie grains. In the Midwest, where we have a lot of concentrated agriculture, so confined animal feeding operations, CAFOs, they eat mostly corn and soy. And that's during that last third of their lives. So grass-fed beef has some advantages. Comparing the pros and cons here. Grass-fed beef is advantageous because manure is being spread over the land instead of being concentrated in one area, where it can cause a lot of pollution, mainly phosphorus pollution, which causes eutrophication of lakes. So you've probably all seen a lake that's totally green and gross. Yeah, that could have been caused by manure. And then less fertilizer would therefore be needed if the cows are grazing grass and they're fertilizing it with their manure. But some people will also make claims that cows can protect grassland health. Well, yeah, only if it was a grassland in the first place. So if you're cutting down forests to grow beef, this is not a pro anymore of grass-fed beef. So it's only beneficial when we're not cutting down forests, and we're not overstocking the cows, and the cows aren't selectively grazing stuff, and the cows aren't eliminating important native plants at the expense of that would normally support soil health better. So this one is very, very subjective here. And then cons of grass-fed beef. This actually uses more land. So if you're not, to get cows up to weight, they're going to need more space to get more grass to reach the desired weight for sale. Then eating just grass, because it's more dilute in nutrients, takes more time, and they're going to need just more food by volume, like I was saying. Then one thing, that I did not mention is that, is this one thing that I skipped over there is the big issue with cows, right, is methane emissions from enteric fermentation in their guts. So cattle have high rate of emissions due to that, and due to those microbes living in their guts, helping to pre-digest their food, also producing methane. Per day, the grass-fed cattle are producing lower emissions, but over their overall lifetime, they're producing approximately the same amount of emissions as the conventional cattle, because the grass-fed cattle are taking longer to reach the desired weight. So so lower per day emissions cancels out with the more time that's needed. And so in summary, grass-fed beef systems do not necessarily sequester as much carbon as natural grasslands. Different studies say different things. They list these different pros and cons and say that they weigh differently, but the jury is still out. So really, right now, we can only say that they're approximately equal within error. It's very variable. And another thing that is kind of unusual about thinking about the carbon footprint of your food is that fish are super duper weird and complicated. So I am not an ocean scientist, but I can tell you that the emissions due to fish are very, very variable based on the type of fish. So wild flounder and wild lobster, for example, cause a large amount of emissions. Wild lobster and other bottom-dwelling seafood, so anything that crawls along on the ocean floor, is harvested through what's called trawling, where you drape a big net down to the bottom and scrape the ocean floor over and over. And that destroys the ocean floor and collects a lot of other fish that you do not want. And you end up throwing them back or killing them. And so this creates a lot of extra emissions, not to mention ecological impacts. Yikes. So, yeah, we will make these slides available so you could look up this stuff, but basically very, very variable. It's not, farmed isn't necessarily better than wild or vice versa, and fish isn't necessarily better than chicken either. So on average, fish has a bit lower emissions than chicken, but it really depends on the fish. And then this is just greenhouse gas emissions are not the only impact here. We also have to think about water impact. So some fish use up a lot of water when they are farmed, such as carp, catfish, tilapia, or silver pighead. And you might be wondering if we're running out of fish. Well, okay, technically, no, we're not running out of fish right now, but there are a lot of fish that are being overfished. So a lot of fish populations, we can't just, say unilaterally for every species, whether it's being overfished or not. Some are being overfished in certain places, and some are being sustainably fished in other places. And so we're not running out of fish stocks right now. There was some article a while back that said we might run out by 2048, but that's not going to happen per se, based on current trends in fish stocks. But the trends do not take into account ocean acidification, warming of the water, or plastic pollution necessarily, because obviously those things are getting worse. But the fun thing about ocean acidification especially is that it has what's called thresholds, so tipping points. And once you pass those thresholds, you start seeing exponential changes, not linear changes like we're seeing, or even gradual non-linear changes like we're seeing here. So the jury's kind of still out on this one too. We just have to keep fighting for our oceans, or else, yes, they will collapse. It's just, it all depends on what actions we take. Okay, I think we can skip that one. Basically, if we do all this cool stuff that I talked about, we'll achieve negative emissions. That's what's going on here. Okay, so what does this look like exactly? What are these solutions? What are some solutions that can happen on the farm, and what do those look like exactly? So we've looked at the consumer end stuff, like ways to help you choose what type of food to eat, but that's not the whole picture. Different foods can be grown or raised in different ways. So so there's a variety of different techniques, but basically, instead of monocrops, instead of annual crops, we need to grow diverse crops that are rotated with each other, and perennials and tree crops alongside the livestock, and use the manure from the livestock to then apply onto the land where we're growing the crops. And this isn't new news. This is from 2009. And so the answer to this question, the answer to the question of where can we even put the carbon is still the same, the soil and the plants. And if we know some techniques that work, what exactly is stopping us? Like, why hasn't this happened? Okay, beyond the obvious economics and politics and stuff, the answer is actually soil. Soil is really, really complicated. So if there's political will, there will be a way. But what's holding back things technically when it comes to technology and best practices on the farm is lack of understanding of soil. We actually know less about soil than we do about deep space. And that is because soil is very complex. And this is something that I really love about soil, actually, as a soil scientist. So all soils have different parts to them. They have minerals, different types of minerals like quartz and clay, and they have organic matter in them. So that's all the dead stuff in soil, as well as living microbes and insects and things that aren't even shown here. And then in between all these solid things, there's air and water. And all of these are interacting with each other all the time. And so we're not just seeing two things interacting with each other, we're seeing dozens of things interacting with each other. And even within water, for example, there are thousands, perhaps millions of chemicals in there at any given time, all interacting with these particles. And we can't just slap these things on a microscope and look at them, unfortunately, because they're dark, literally dark. We're literally in the dark about soil because the techniques that we have developed for chemistry, for biology, for physics fail in the face of soil. So there's just too much solid stuff, too much interactions in here. And they are therefore the greatest source of uncertainty in climate models and in determining best practices for land management and designing sustainable food systems. And soil, and this is very important that we do figure this out at least better than we have right now, because soil can be our saving grace or it can be our downfall. Soil has the potential to cool the planet with the help of plants. So you can start at any part in this, what we call a feedback loop, and see the effect. First off, if we decrease temperature, that will decrease the activity of the microbes in the soil, reducing the amount of CO2, carbon dioxide, they produce. And then that will decrease global temperatures, reducing the amount of soil respiration from the microbes, reducing CO2 again. And this just keeps cycling and cooling the planet, which would be really awesome if we could get it to do that. Then another thing happens, if the microbes aren't eating up the organic matter in the soil really fast, that will increase the amount of soil organic matter. And that increases soil quality, which in turn increases photosynthesis, and that will reduce carbon dioxide emissions and will reduce carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And that would be really awesome. We can actually drive this spiral, this feedback in this direction with sustainable management practices. But if we choose the wrong practices, we can activate a spiral in the opposite direction, which would cause more warming. So increased carbon dioxide emissions cause an increase in temperature, cause an increase in soil respiration, causes increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Also, increased soil respiration, reduced organic matter, reduced soil quality, reduced photosynthesis, and so on and so forth. So we have to be really, really careful with soil. So what do we do? So a lot of these things that I showed you in this diagram before can be used to increase the amount of carbon in the soil over time and reduce the emissions and activate that spiral in the desired direction. And fun story, this figure actually inspired my career because this was from State of the World 2009, and it mentioned this interesting thing called biochar. So unlike the other practices that I mentioned, which work overall, actually I have some examples here. So the other practices, I've gotten ahead of myself. So in general, soil carbon sequestration practices work by taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, putting it in plants, and then the plants put that into the soil, and that stays in the soil as soil organic matter. And if we can reduce the amount, if we can increase the amount of plant matter added to the soil, or reduce the amount of losses back to the atmosphere from microbes eating all that organic matter, then we can sequester carbon in the soil. So increase inputs, reduce outputs, in other words. Those things in the diagram before have a little bit more detail to them. Practices that we can do to boost soil organic matter and sequester carbon in soil. So to give you just a tiny bit more detail, it looks like we're getting a little low on time, tiny bit more detail. One practice is reducing tillage. So tillage is, stirring up the soil, and that literally destroys soil structure. And soil structures like aggregates, clumps of soil, those protect the soil protect the organic matter in the soil from the microbes and keep it in the soil. Then if you reduce erosion by carefully managing the landscape to basically reduce the slope and also plant crops perpendicular to that slope, that will reduce the amount of organic matter that's being carried off by water and by wind. Then you can also, of course, add organic amendments to soil. This increases inputs, but you have to be careful where these come from. They don't come from nowhere. So obviously from your own garden, this is great. But if these amendments could have been applied more locally to where they were sourced, that would be better than transporting them, for example. And you can't count these twice. So the seller of the organic amendments cannot count the carbon credits while the person who's adding them counts the credits again. You can only count it once. Then cover crops and perennials. If we just keep the soil covered, that will reduce erosion and also add more organic matter to the soil directly because there'll be more plants over time. Okay, so back to that biochar thing I was talking about that inspired my career. So biochar was first itself inspired by what's called terra preta, Amazonian dark earths. These are soils where native peoples, ancient Amazonian peoples, had been applying some kind of charcoal-like material on purpose or by accident, we don't know, but they had these terra preta soils compared with the nearby soils of tropical soils, natural tropical soils of the Amazon, were much more fertile and rich in organic matter. And so scientists were like, what is going on? That char that the native peoples were adding to the soil was sticking around for some reason for hundreds to thousands of years. And this doesn't just happen in the Amazon, it also happens in places that experience regular fire as part of their natural cycle, like grasslands. And that char contributes like 10 to 30% of the carbon in Iowa soils, so it's responsible for a lot of the corn belt's fertility. The question is, can we add this stuff to soil on purpose and sequester carbon on purpose? And hence, enter biochars. So biochar is not just one material, but biochars are a suite of man-made pyrolyzed, quote-unquote, charred materials. So it's made by purposefully heating up biomass, so plant material, basically baking it with no oxygen at very high temperatures. Like we're talking 300 to 800 degrees Celsius, much, much hotter than your own oven. And these can be made from a variety of materials. They all have different properties, all have different benefits, advantages, disadvantages, and they all need to be matched with soils so that they can have the maximum effect. So the one thing that biochar can do pretty consistently is store carbon in soil. And so why is that? Well, basically, microbes don't want to eat it. So the organic matter that you would normally add to soil, like when plants die, or if you were to add mulch to soil instead of biochar, that contains very easy to degrade compounds that microbes know exactly how to gobble up, and they will gobble that up and turn it into carbon dioxide. But biochar has a lot of what we call double bonds. You can think of this as kind of like reinforced steel or something in these honeycomb shapes. And these are really, really strong. And the bonds are hard to break. So the microbes say, nope, we're not going to eat that. We're going to eat the other stuff. And so the biochar stays in the soil for hundreds to thousands of years. We lose about half the carbon when first making the biochar to the atmosphere, unfortunately, but because it lasts so long, we can keep it in the soil. Also, the byproducts of making biochar, which are sometimes the desired primary products, are biofuels. So with a biochar system, we can make biofuels without competing with land, with crops for land. So without competing for food crops, we can make biochar out of food wastes instead, or yard trimmings, or wood industry waste, and even newspaper. And biochar has a bunch of other benefits as well, in addition to carbon capture. It can reduce, for the atmosphere, it can reduce nitrous oxide emissions from soils. It can reduce methane emissions from soils. I talked about the energy. And also, you can mix it with manure or just literally anything that's smelly, put it on top of something smelly, to reduce the odor. And you can even put it on your compost pile to improve the quality of the compost and reduce any odors from compost, which shouldn't have odors, but sometimes it does. Then biochar can also hold on to nutrients. Can you guys see that? Okay. It holds on to nutrients. And we already mentioned increases soil carbon. And by holding on to nutrients as well as holding on to water, by improving soil structure, biochar improves soil fertility. And it's been shown that if biochar improves soil fertility and increases crop growth, then it usually does have a net negative effect, net negative emissions. Does have a net, there we go, it is zooming in. Yay. Okay, so biochar does improve soil fertility and increase plant growth, the plants will remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, hence making the whole process of making biochar and applying it to the soil more carbon negative. Soils are super complex and diverse and alive, evolving ecosystems that are vital and degradable and delicate. And biochars can help improve the quality of soil. We do have to match the biochars with the correct soil in order for this to work. And because they are also complex. Since we're about out of time, I will share conclusions. In summary, sustainable food systems, whether or not they include biochar, are essential to fighting climate change, but we have to keep some things in mind. We cannot fight climate change with sustainable food systems only. Sustainable food systems cannot be used as an excuse to keep polluting. So frequently, fossil fuel companies try to claim that they're investing in sustainable agriculture or some such. That's been shown to proven through modeling that this will cause major issues, trying to offset things with agriculture. Then finally, the sustainable food systems must be designed with utmost care to ensure that they are indeed sustainable and are indeed fighting climate change. So that, I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, and I've seen some questions already coming in. And I do want to acknowledge all of the libraries again. That Miriam kindly mentioned at the beginning. So thank you to all of the libraries. Okay, ashes are not the same as biochar. I'm just starting to answer the questions. You guys can keep asking more questions. Invasive fish species, yes, you should eat those. Okay, I'm getting distracted. So ashes in the fireplace are not the same as biochar. If the temperature becomes too high when making biochar, or you let in oxygen, that will burn off too much of the carbon and it won't stay in the biochar. So ashes are good to apply to the soil because they have nutrients, but they don't actually sequester much carbon at all in the soil. Wildfires are a net source of carbon, not a net sink. Only a small portion of wildfire and carbon ends up in the soil as black carbon, but soils that naturally have a large amount of carbon are important to protect.